Right, so this video is going to talk about how the production possibilities frontier can shift and how this gives us a first way to look at or think about economic growth. So we've already had a video to introduce the production possibilities frontier. It's a very powerful graph. It's the first graph we do. Is a very powerful graph in being able to let us see this idea of feasibility of like what's possible in an economy at a given point of time. And that's very important for economic analysis because we need to make sure we're comparing um, actually feasible or possible outcomes with each other in order to make choice properly. We really don't want to let something that's not truly possible, some kind of utopian alternative, appear to be a choice that we have. So we want to make sure we can compare choices that are truly possible for us in the real world, and the PPF gives us a good way to look at that. Now, the production possibilities frontier is drawn for a given amount of resources and technology, and we also say institutions or economic organizations, the way we want to organize economic activity. If any of those change, if any of those factors change, we would have to draw a new PPF. And so this graph is going to show you a couple of different ways we can have that shift occur. Now, what I'll talk about here is the most common, probably the best way to think about this would be a change in technology. So if we look at over the long span of human history, we've gotten much more prosperous over the last 300 years, especially than in the past. Why is that? Well, a big part of it is new technology. We simply have ways to put things together and produce output that we couldn't before. But a part of technology is also what's known as the division of labor. And as you divide a task up more and more, is you take one, they think of like the assembly line is a great example of division of labor. As you divide up tasks in a production process, that also in and of itself tends to allow a much faster rate of production. And as you divide up tasks more and more, and you do the same task over and over, that also tends to relate to people want to come up with little tools or things to help them do a task that they do frequently and do repeatedly. They come up with a new way of doing, new tools to help them do that faster. And even if you want to think about it, artificial intelligence and robots in many ways are sort of like the limiting thing of that. If you have a mechanical action that has to be done repeatedly, that's exactly the kinds of things that people build robots to actually be able to help with. So when technology changes, we can draw a new production possibilities frontier. And what's going to happen is that we'd be able to shift that production possibilities frontier out. And that would mean that things that allocations of goods that were previously not possible would become feasible. So, two different graphs here because there are two different ways that you could shift the PPF out. The first one I've drawn here, and on the axis now I have food and housing. So I just want to talk about goods that could be, using different kinds of technology, because in a second we'll talk about a different way we could think of technology improving. So let's suppose that there's something that could improve our ability to produce goods and services. And let's say that this is something that's very broad across the economy. By broad across the economy, I mean it could affect the production of both food and housing. So you might think of something like computers or the internet, computer-aided manufacturing, or our ability to build robots, maybe new transportation. If we have a breakthrough in technology, we're going to shift the production possibilities frontier out, because given the amount of resources we have, if we have no change in the amount of resources, if we have better technology, we can produce more using the same amount of inputs. If we have a technological change that would work across the entire economy, then we're going to shift the entire production possibilities frontier out. So the new PPF might look something like this. And shift it out for the production of both goods and services. And then if we look at this, here's a point, we'll call this A, and we can see that point A previously was outside of the production possibilities frontier. So we couldn't actually get to that level of that amount of food and housing previously. And now with the new technology, while A is actually inside the frontier, it becomes feasible and we could readily get to that. Now, there's another way in which technology could affect the economy. There might be technology that would apply, say, for the production of food, but not for the production of housing. So you think of like new types of tractors, more efficient tractors. And then if we're going to think about like, well, how would that affect the economy? It would allow us to produce more food, but it wouldn't necessarily allow us to produce any more housing. So we want to think that improved technology is going to shift the PPF out. But if it's sector specific technology, something that was going to affect the production of food but not housing, it's only going to shift the production possibilities frontier out along the x-axis, along the food axis, not along the housing axis. So that would give us something like this in terms of our improvement in shifting out in this way. Now, one of the things we can see is that although we technically say this is something that allows us to produce more food, it is possible then we could end up at a point like A here, and if you compare A with maybe point B, let's just say B was where we were at previously on the PPF, and now we're out at point A. If you compare A and B, we would have both more food and more housing. And you might, but then you might be thinking like, oh, isn't there something inconsistent here? I said that this new technology would allow us to produce more food, so it's technology that's affecting the production of food, but not housing. So we didn't shift the y-axis intercept of the PPF up at all. But if you compare A and B, we would see we'd have both more food and more housing. Well, that's not inconsistent, because what would be happening is that the production of food, our ability to produce food is improved. So we can produce more food, but we could also produce the same amount of food using fewer resources. So what we're actually doing, if you compare points A and B, we're producing more food than we had at point A than we would have had at point B. That's due to the increased productivity of agriculture. But then we're also probably reallocating some resources that were previously going into the production of the food to allow us to produce some more housing. So when we think of the trade-off, after we adjust our trade-off, we will end up with more housing and food, even though when we first described the technology, we said like this is a type of technology that allows us to produce more food, but not more housing. We can end up with more of both. We can end up with more of both because we can produce more food more efficiently or more effectively, and that allows us to not only produce more food, but free up some resources, and it allows us to produce some more housing. So we can end up with more of both goods, even when it's technology that would just shift out the production possibility for one of the goods, not both of the goods. Now, I'm not going to draw it here because it would just make the diagram a mess, but we could also have, if there was technology that would affect housing but not food, we'd shift the PPF, we'd increase the y-axis intercept, but not the food axis intercept. So you could have a technological change that would be biased or in the direction of the other good as well. I'll just mention this here. We won't draw it because it's not like the outcome we're really ever hoping for. But you can also think about the production possibilities frontier shifting in. No, that would be the opposite of progress. So regression. And what could happen there is that, and we have seen this over the course of human history, when a civilization collapses and standards of living, like for instance, when the Roman civilization collapsed, standards of living fell. So how would we explain something like that? Well, there's a couple of ways we could see the production possibilities frontier shift in. One could be some kind of natural or man-made disaster that destroys a lot of our capital resources, factories. And so the World War II, if you think of what happened to the economies of the countries that fought World War II, especially Germany and Japan after losing World War II, their countries were devastated by bombings and the effect of the war. And so their factories were in ruins. Their capital stock, their ability to produce goods and services had been reduced. So that could be one case where we could think of a shifting of the PPF. A natural disaster could similarly affect capital stop and reduce our ability to produce goods and services. If a natural disaster leads to disruption of roads and bridges, destroys the transportation infrastructure, that could reduce our ability to produce goods and services. Another thing that happens like when a society collapses is that you could have economic institutions that were previously in place that then go away. And so a part of why you might think of the production possibilities frontier shifting in after the collapse of Rome is that Rome could provide us framework with laws and property rights, and you could have trade within the empire, and that allowed for more production. But when Rome collapses and all these different areas are now ruled by different groups of different tribes, you no longer have that large area of economic integration, and you in fact had some institutions or things that allow us to help produce goods and services go away. So there is also the possibility that you could shift the PPF in. Now, later in the class, we'll come back in a couple of chapters and talk about growth theory. And growth theory is, I think, in chapters 11 and 12. And growth theory is really talking about like what we can do to help shift this PPF out over time. What can we do to really sort of help fuel technological change? When we talk about what's happening here, we're just saying like, oh, when technology improves, this is how we can think about it. This is the effect of it on the economy. But if we want technology improve, and if we want improved living standards, then growth theory, which is what we'll cover in chapters 11 and 12, is going to come back and talk about like what can we systematically do to help make sure that our economy's PPF shifts out over time, because that's what's going to lead to economic growth. So that's technology and how that shifts the PPF.